What's good, my friends? I'm back again with another video for you ladies and gentlemen. So today, we're going to be responding to Rachel Oates' video, Did God Forget About Us?
Don't forget about it. Don't, baby, don't let it go. No, baby, don't forget about it.
Sorry about that. I just couldn't resist. That song was hot back in the day. Anyway, one of her videos popped up in my feed, so this was actually the very first video I've watched from her. My impression is that she seems to be a genuinely nice person, which I can very much appreciate. However, after viewing a few more of her videos about God and atheism, she just regurgitates many of the same basic flawed arguments and commits many of the same basic fallacies a lot of atheists make. And so with that said, let's get into it.
I've been thinking a little bit recently, and I have a couple of questions that I was hoping I could kind of put to you guys and see what you think about a few things. So maybe some other atheists will agree with me on this. Maybe some religious people will be able to tell me that I'm wrong, why I'm wrong, tell me I'm an idiot, whatever you want. But here's what I've been thinking about. So speaking like completely hypothetically here, let's just assume that the Bible is true. That, you know, let's ignore all the inconsistencies, ignore all the like random little facts it gets wrong and mixes up and names that are wrong and anything like that. Let's ignore all of that, okay?
Obviously, this wasn't a video meant to get into the specifics about what alleged errors she thinks is in the Bible. But it's funny how she just throws that in there as if she's so sure she knows what she's talking about. And since she didn't actually explain anything, there's nothing to respond to. But perhaps there's another video of hers I haven't seen where she actually explains all this. But in the meantime, let's continue on.
Let's assume hypothetically for now that the Bible is true, everything in it is true, and that the things it writes about are in fact the word of a God. A God does exist, and the Bible is his words. I'm sure I could have said that better. So assuming all of this, the Bible is full of rules that have been set down by God, and you know, it's all full of things like we shouldn't kill people, we shouldn't steal, we shouldn't mix meat and dairy in a meal, we shouldn't plant more than one type of seed in a field, you know, the important stuff, right? So God gave us all these rules like a couple of thousand years ago now, and then he just stopped. And I want to know why. I mean, throughout the Bible, you can see that God does kind of change a bit. Like, the God of the New Testament is not the same as the God of the Old Testament, right? And in one way or another, he's kind of giving rules throughout the Bible. And these do kind of adapt as society adapts, and they change. The rules that he gave in Genesis are not the same as the rules he gives later on. You know, you have new rules introduced and stuff like that.
There are several things we need to hit on here. But before we get into that, we need to first understand the conclusion she's attempting to build by making this argument. At the end of this video, she bases the argument she's given on the following possible explanations.
All I can think that this means is that A, is proof that a God doesn't exist and that the Bible isn't true. B, is proof that a God does exist, but he just doesn't really care enough or can't be bothered to get involved anymore in our lives. Or C, a God does exist and he's just trying to teach us a lesson and get us to think for ourselves, but when we do it wrong, he's going to punish us anyway, right? So
When she claimed God changes and isn't the same from the Old Testament to the New, her basis for saying that is essentially, given the progression of the ages of human history, there are changes which occur throughout the ages. As the ages change, God is making and changing laws consistent with the changing times. She therefore thinks that because times change and God makes and changes laws consistent with the changing times, God himself also changes. The problem with this argument is two things. The first thing is that it is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means when Christians say God doesn't change. This is referring to God's very being, his character. His very being, his character is unchanging. The misunderstanding also in turn highlights the second problem. The argument is a total non sequitur. The term non sequitur is Latin, which literally means does not follow. In other words, it does not follow that because God makes and changes laws throughout the ages of human history, it also must therefore mean God himself also changes. that he isn't the same from the Old Testament to the New. And what we are talking about again, when we say God is unchanging, we are talking about his character. A simple analogy can illustrate why this argument is invalid. Let's take parents raising a child. When their child is 5 years old, they may have their kid go to bed at, let's say, 8 o'clock. When their child is 15 years old, they may have their kid go to bed at 11 o'clock. Does this mean the parents therefore change? No. The child's parents can have the same character at them being 15 years old as they did when the child was 5 years old. What changed was the maturity of the child, not the character of the parents, although they did change their rules. The parents do not need to have the same rules to still maintain the same character. Given how humans are more complex than even us humans can comprehend, God deals with humans accordingly, given all sorts of criterion: age, sin, spiritual maturity or lack thereof, circumstances, etc. All these things change, but God does not. A change of rules and or laws does not equate to a change of character. And to equate these things is again a non sequitur argument. Now, as far as her claim about God allegedly having fewer rules and laws and allegedly getting more silent over time, her expectation is the following: that if the Bible is true, we should still expect God to be changing rules and laws today, and also expect he isn't as silent as he allegedly appears to be. After all, times haven't stopped changing, so why did God stop today when times are still changing, but God didn't stop back then, until later on, that is, when times were also changing throughout the ages back then? To her, this is problematic. And again, what is her explanation for what accounts for this alleged problem?
All I can think that this means is that A is proof that a God doesn't exist and that the Bible isn't true. B is proof that a God does exist, but he just doesn't really care enough or can't be bothered to get involved anymore in our lives. Or C, a God does exist and he's just trying to teach us a lesson and get us to think for ourselves, but when we do it wrong, he's going to punish us anyway, right? So
here's the problem with this argument. She's committing a logical fallacy known as a false trichotomy. To save on video editing time, as these videos take a long time for me to make and require a lot of work, I've provided an explanation in the description of what a false trichotomy is for those who may not know. If you need to, pause this video now, read the explanation in the description, and then resume the video afterwards. Assuming those who didn't know what a false dichotomy was have read the description by now, you can easily put together what a false trichotomy is, which is of course presenting only three possible explanations when there is at least a fourth possible explanation. This is what Rachel is doing. She's presented only three possible explanations. And what are they again?
all I can think that this means is that A is proof that a God doesn't exist and that the Bible isn't true. B is proof that a God does exist, but he just doesn't really care enough or can't be bothered to get involved anymore in our lives. Or C, a God does exist and he's just trying to teach us a lesson and get us to think for ourselves, but when we do it wrong, he's going to punish us anyway, right? So
now, with all this in mind, all we have to do is consider a fourth possible explanation. She simply has a fundamental misunderstanding of what she's reading in Scripture and predicated her three flawed possible explanations on false premises from the outset. Let's lay this out. First of all, who says that God ever went silent in the first place? She wants to claim God's alleged silence is a possible proof God actually doesn't exist. But what about the millions to billions of people who claim wholeheartedly God speaks to them? Apparently, God isn't being silent to them. God merely appearing silent to her is not only not proof God doesn't exist, but it also isn't proof at all that God is silent. Romans 10:13 says, "Whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved." In other words, God is an immediate reality in the lives of all those who shall call upon his name in genuine contrition. I'm pretty sure that means God isn't silent. I'm not sure if she's even that well studied at all in Scripture because there are a plethora of verses in the Bible, which makes it very evident God isn't silent today. Way too many to summarize in this video. She needs to do deeper research into Christian theology as there's so much stuff out there on this, given the question she's asking about. The glory of God is anything but silent. Why doesn't she consider the plethora of testimonies from people who claim God speaks to them as a possible proof that not only God does exist, but also that he isn't silent at all? It seems quite clear to me she's arbitrarily calling something proof for a thing if it seems to favor her argument, but refusing to consider the possibility things like personal testimonies may be proof against her argument. Second of all, what about this issue she speaks of regarding this concept? There's not as many rules and laws today. She's actually operating on yet even more fundamental misunderstandings of Scripture. But let's entertain her thought anyway as she presented it. Number one, why does that even matter? If God wanted to have 1 trillion laws back then and only 2 now, he could do that for whatever purposes he sovereignly ordains. She gives 3 possible explanations for her argument. She's necessarily acknowledging that such does not logically necessitate an argument God does not exist. Now for the 2 other explanations, God simply doesn't care, or he wants to teach us something, yet punish us anyway when we mess up. All this is a personal emotional problem, not an intellectual problem. There's absolutely no obligation for God to care, nor is there any obligation for God not to punish us when we mess up. A lot of atheists seem to directly or indirectly pass off standards to God as if God must adhere to them, as if in some way they are supposed to be the judge of God and can tell him how to be God. If they don't like what God does and how he does it, that's just too bad. And number 2, it has nothing to do with the amount of laws throughout the ages anyway. Rather, it's about what the purposes are for the laws God decrees. Purposes for the laws God decrees can be divided into 3 categories: moral law, ceremonial law, and civil law, also known as judicial law. I have a link in the description explaining these, as it would take way too long for me to explain them in this video. But what is not logical to do is to attack something before she even attempts to seriously research what she's attacking. And my friends, I apologize. It took a long time to explain all that, but I believe it was absolutely necessary to debunk this essential core foundation she builds her argument on. And having said all that, let's see what she has to say next.
So why did he just suddenly stop giving us new rules? Society never stopped changing. I don't understand.
Well, hopefully given what's been said, you'll begin to understand. That is, if you're sincerely honest about considering new information.
There's so many people out there who look at these really old texts, because that's what the Bible is. It is a really old text. And they kind of extract rules from that and pick bits out, and they kind of twist them and interpret them in different ways and try and apply them to our society today. But then this means that all different people end up with all sorts of different interpretations of things, because we don't have God anymore saying, don't do this, do this, don't do this, do this. People have to make their own interpretations, like from things he said in the past, and that just seems counterproductive to me.
First of all, I really love it when atheists focus on saying the Bible is old and isn't relevant in today's society. These are the same people saying what's in the Bible are total myths, yet spend their whole lives attempting to disprove it. Something which holds absolutely no relevance in today's world wouldn't even be given the sheer attention and time of day. Second of all, to hit on her twisting scripture point, I do agree that way too many believers try to twist scripture, but a lot of atheists also attempt to twist it. This isn't to suggest that Christians twisting scripture is okay because there are atheists out there doing it, but to point out to her that she should be just as critical about her fellow atheists when they attempt to twist scripture as well. An example of this would be when atheists twist scripture by thinking Christians are supposed to kill gay people today by stoning, and that's simply false. Third of all, it's interesting she points out how many people have different interpretations, yet she isn't applying that same criteria to her own argument, considering the possibility her interpretation of what she's read is incorrect. Has she thought that maybe her view of what she gathers from Scripture is just yet another interpretation and could be wrong? And lastly, her claiming because God isn't literally saying do this or this, it therefore means many people are left to their own interpretations, and to her this is counterproductive. However, this is based on yet another fundamental misunderstanding of what's going on in Scripture. Even in the Old Testament, there was confusion among God's chosen people because of sin, which is the root of sinful pride and rebellion. Just because people like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Noah, etc. knew the Lord very intimately doesn't mean all people did. She seems to assume God was communicating with every human on the planet on what to do and don't do in some non-human way, similar to how we talk to each other as humans. Now, if this is her assumption, then I challenge her to find scriptural evidence to back that up. There is nothing new under the sun. Humankind, since sin entered the world, has had confusion in laws and doctrine throughout the ages, not just in today's times, but also in every era. God has had people he specifically chose and communicated himself to in order to enact his sovereign will. Different interpretations of the Bible aren't arguments against it any more than different interpretations of scientific findings are evidence against the findings and or science.
I'd have thought if God cared enough to make rules about how we shouldn't wear clothes woven of two different fabrics at once, he'd care enough to make rules about today's society, about things we can and can't do on the internet, about, how we interact with modern technology. I'd have thought this would have been something he cared about, but apparently not. For all the times God gave rules, like a couple of thousand years ago, about what we should and shouldn't eat, how we should live our lives, what we should wear, how we should dress. Surely he has some opinions about that stuff today. I mean, does God have an opinion on Tinder? What about fidget spinners, or BuzzFeed, or Netflix, or even just the internet in general? Why did God just stop giving us any new rules? Did he get bored?
All she's really doing is continuing to argue on a fundamental misunderstanding of what's going on in Scripture, which is again based in ignorance of moral law, ceremonial law, and civil law. She fallaciously assumes that what we see in the Bible is God giving specific commands for nearly every aspect of all of humankind, up until a certain point, and that's just simply false. She's doing what's called eisegesis, which means reading into the text. She isn't at all considering that there are people way more educated than her about what Scripture says who can offer her different views about what's being said. Given closer examination, what we see is not that God is giving specific commands for nearly every aspect of all of humankind throughout the ages, but what he's doing when dealing with his chosen people, the Israelites, for the purpose of fulfilling the coming of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. There is nothing at all in the Bible which indicates God is just looking at every nation on the planet in every era and telling them a bunch of comprehensive laws for those eras. She's extrapolating, knowingly or unknowingly, seeing what's happening with how God is dealing with the Israelites and fallaciously assuming that is also how he's dealing with every nation of people on the planet. She is simply reading into something which isn't there. Moral law speaks on what is based on God's holy nature, which has to do with laws we are required to follow throughout all time. This includes things like thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not bear false witness, etc. The Bible teaches us that God has written his word on our hearts in Romans 2:15 and Hebrews 10:16. It doesn't matter what era we're in. God has put the innate awareness in us that stealing is wrong, no matter whether it was done in times of antiquity or whether we do it on the internet in today's modern times. If bearing false witness is wrong, it doesn't magically become not wrong because it's done on social media. God communicates himself to our conscience in such a way that he does not need to give a comprehensive list of do's and don'ts in every era of human history. The only thing that really changes is how we interact with the world, given the advancement of technology. But that doesn't mean God's moral law just disappears, as if God just has no clue on how to communicate his desires in the modern era. She's operating on several false premises, and thus is building a fallacious foundation for her reasoning.
I don't know, it just seems weird that if the Bible was true, if a God really existed, and if he really did give us all these rules to live by, why would he just suddenly leave us to our own devices and let us figure things out ourselves?
My friends, seeing as how we've exposed her of massive ignorance, the basis for her even asking that question is flawed from the outset. Again, she continues to operate on all these false premises based on her ignorance of what Scripture is really saying. It gets really old and tiring to teach atheists these common things when all they have to do is simply do a little bit of basic research. It's really sad and embarrassing.
All I can think that this means is that A, is proof that a God doesn't exist and that the Bible isn't true. B, is proof that a God does exist, but he just doesn't really care enough or can't be bothered to get involved anymore in our lives. Or C, a God does exist and he's just trying to teach us a lesson and get us to think for ourselves, but when we do it wrong, he's going to punish us anyway, right? But in that case, why the sudden change in teaching style? Why did he suddenly decide to mix things up like this? Just none of it makes any sense to me, which is why I would probably think this is proof that a God doesn't exist. But that's just me, that's my interpretation.
As noted earlier, she spoke about all sorts of different interpretations, yet she admits here this is also just her interpretation. Now, if you have something that you think is just your interpretation, it isn't merely that you simply believe it's your interpretation when you attack it without doing your own comprehensive research. At that point, it's just throwing out deliberate attacks to Scripture to suit your own personal biases. As I said in the beginning of this video, I believe she's genuinely a nice person. At the same time, I suspect she isn't asking these questions in good faith, especially when we see things in her description like this. And as I also said in the beginning, she was talking as if she truly believed she knew what she was talking about when she said the Bible gets certain facts wrong. I really hope she's being genuine about these issues concerning the Bible and Christianity, but I suspect that's not the case. And so with that said, that's it for this video, my friends. And I know I say this in every video, but it cannot be said and stressed enough that I humbly appreciate your continued support in making these videos. And so if you like what you see, please like, share, and subscribe. With that, I bid you all adieu. Take care. God bless. Deuces.